Dad always used to say the only causes worth fighting for were the lost causes.
The Senator yield. No, sir, I will not yield.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
You're listening to a Pyrolitical Pyrocast.
Welcome to the Pyrocast presented by Pyrolitical Radio Show. Hey everyone, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Randall.
We have some great topics for you tonight. We're really excited to be back as always. Before we get into this, we just want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Pyrolitical Live.
Do that. Do it now.
Go there and do that. I think we're up to 50 something. So we just need to build. So any support you can give us, we love. And then hit that little notification bell so you'll get our weekly notification that we've got a video up. Because we are videoing this podcast or vlogcast, and we always post those the next day or so. So Randall, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Couldn't be better.
Couldn't be better?
Well, okay. I think we could always be a little better, but I'm feeling pretty good. How about you? You feeling good?
If I was any better, it would be a crime. I've never understood that phrase. I've heard that.
You know, so many of the phrases that we say on a daily basis, if you really break them down, it's like they're the opposite. You know, it's like, oh, well, it's the least I could do. Really? It's the absolute least thing you could do. Like you couldn't do any less for me. And, you know, it just, I think the connotation we have there is, oh, you know, it wasn't much, you know, don't worry about it. But when you break it down, it's like, no, I'm saying I really don't care about you. I absolutely, you know, that's the very least I could do to help you.
I use that phrase and I say, it's the least I could do, but the most that I will.
Awesome.
Bless your heart.
I love that.
Well, Randall, it's been a crazy week, whether you're looking at federal politics or terrorism over in the UK. It's been the Trump story has been nuts with the Comey affair. We did that show a couple weeks ago about former director James Comey, and it just keeps looking worse and worse for Trump. But then again, maybe it's fake news, as he says. I think he calls everything fake news, whether it is or not. But I don't know. Just been interesting.
I know.
It does. Firing someone who's investigating you or something around you is questionable.
It is questionable. I mean, and so obviously the news media is up in arms. They're like, oh, you know, big red flags all over the place, understandably. But it's like, really? I mean, some people are saying this is the worst thing that's ever happened in Washington, D.C., and I'm like, just go look at history, like the last couple years, you know, and I'm sure you'll find something bigger. Not that I'm an avid Trump supporter. I'm not, but I just think people need to get a little more real. I mean, especially when it's not your guy that's in the office, right? We tend to want to say, oh, you know, if he sneezes wrong, we're going to get him. We're going to pin him to the wall. We're going to make him pay. Yeah. Does that really help anything?
Well, there's probably three ways to look at Trump. There's from the strict constitutional perspective, you know, what is he doing as according to his oath? Then there's the next perspective, which is he's a complete liar. We hate him. This is what the talk shows do, you know, at night. Just lambaste the guy. And then there's the whole, well, I genuinely want to analyze his morals and his principles. So you can mix that with the constitutional view. If you just hate him, you hate him. But there's enough troubling stuff that he says and does that he genuinely does and says that is, I just sometimes think, I can't say that this is a good man. I mean, he's just really shady in a lot of ways. And anyway, but then some of his speeches are so asinine and ignoramus that you just are like, what are you talking about? So I think there's plenty to look at that that justifies him not being president. But I don't like the late night talk show hit pieces. And I started taking screenshots. I said this a few weeks ago of all the news stories about Trump. Of course, the Fox News stories are usually positive, but the rest are just, it's all negative. So I don't think we need to do that at all. I think there's plenty to analyze him on constitutionally and otherwise. So
yeah, when you just take the debate into just, arguing about every little ticky thing instead of the principle. I mean, the talking principles is powerful, super powerful, because then all of a sudden it's not about, oh, you don't like this guy, right? It's all of a sudden it's about, no, I don't care, about this person as an individual. Either way,
not looking to hang out with him.
Right. It's like, I whether I love him or hate him, it doesn't matter. As long as you have that discussion about principle, then that makes all the difference, because if they're violating principle, they're violating principle. And if you agree on principle, then you can have a dialogue that's productive. Right now, it's just, Republicans saying, barking back at the Democrats that are after Trump, saying, oh, you hate Trump. It doesn't matter what he's doing. You don't like him. And then the Democrats are saying, no, he's an awful person, blah, 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 blah. It's like, who cares? If we continue to have that sort of a debate, we're never going to reach common ground, and you're never going to, just like those that have talked about whether he could get impeached for some of these things, you're never going to reach a point where you could impeach him, regardless of what he may have done, because you've got to reach that common ground with the Republicans in the House and the Senate in order to complete the impeachment process.
Well, he would actually have to stand on a street corner and shoot people, because he said that during the campaign he could do that and still get voters. So he would literally have to do that. And then, I don't know, there would be some conservatives who wouldn't go for that. But I was thinking about, and did you say ticky?
Yeah, ticky.
That's one of those phrases I think we say. We don't know. That's how we started the show. But I forgot what I was going to say. I totally.
No, I think it's really funny.
I apologize.
Because we have these debates over personality and persona, and then we don't ever really get down to the principle. Even when it's the Supreme Court that's having a discussion, they will move away from the principle and they'll talk about issues, and they'll have all issue-based the issue-based discussion, and that's what they base their rulings on, rather than going back to the foundational principles that they're supposed to be discussing. But so it's endemic in our society. We don't want to look at the unhumanized principles. We want to go down to the touchy-feely emotional discussion that's going to make all the difference if we make people feel better. It's just. It's so much better when we talk that way.
Well, I do that for you all the time, Randall. What are you talking about? No. I remembered what I was going to say.
Go for it.
Besides that, personality does matter. Now, I don't know if I've shared this on our shows before, but I have a 3-tier voting system. You have. But I do. But
refresh the viewers. I think it's a good thing.
There's 3 Ps in politics. There's number 1, there's principles, number 2, policies, and number 3, personality. And I gauge a candidate by those 3 things in that order. Number 1, principle has a high weight. Policies has about the same with me, and then personalities a little bit less, because you obviously have to have the constitutional understanding and the principles that keeps you honest and helps you keep your oath. But you also have to know how that translates into policies. That's usually not too hard if you have good principles and understanding. And then third is personality, because you are going to have to work with other people in the same party and other parties to help you get bills passed or to repeal things, preferably. And so I kind of rate those on a scale, and it's pretty good. I mean, rarely do people get over 80% when I'm looking at them, but there has been a few that have. So anyway, that's the way I do it. I feel like even if you were doing the 3-tiered system, you would have to understand the Constitution yourself and policies, how they apply within the constitutional framework. And then, is this a likable person that won't sell out their principles, but they can get some things done? Don't say anything, Randall. You know what I mean. Get things done. We hate that phrase, but can actually persuade people to support liberty-based, legislation.
No, you're right, Thomas. I mean, it is important for people to get some things done, but they need to be in the right direction. We talk about this all the time on the show. I mean, because the best time in the legislative session is when the legislature's out of session. Because then they're not doing anything. They're not ruining anything or messing things up. Business can go on as usual, and people are able to prosper because they can rely on things being the same. And so that's good. But I understand. I know what you mean when you say get things done. You're saying you want
undone.
You want to see a return to positive principle, or not positive principles, but return to benign principles of a positive framework. Is that a good way of putting it?
Get things undone, which would mean repeal, and not necessarily replace, but repeal things. I mean, our code in every state, the state code and the federal code, is massive, and that all started with how to apply the Constitution on a state and federal basis, because code is okay if it explains things, but generally code is adding to or warping the interpretation of state or federal constitution. So generally, Randall, I think in our state, we have a once-a-year legislature for 45 days. They could go for 10 years, at least, not impose any taxes, not create any new laws, and we would prosper even at the current level. We would not need them to do a thing.
What about all the people that need health insurance, Thomas? What about those
they're screwed.
People?
They're on the street.
What about the people that want to get married? Can they get married without the government changing laws? What about the people who want to drink raw milk?
Well, they're just crazy.
It's like I don't know that you could come up with a single scenario where it's not like, you know what? If the government wasn't here, it would be a better scenario than what we've got right now.
Well, I'm not even saying that. Don't change a law. Don't repeal. Don't do anything. Like you said, keep it sustainable or stable, the same. Don't change a thing. And you'd still see, under all this onerous regulation in our state, you would see prosperity because people would know what they can count on. They could predict, even with the crappy high taxation we have and all of the government intrusion. It's like, but at least we'd know. And that's the thing. Government is always talking about jobs and unemployment and investment, quote unquote. It just messes with the market. Subsidies and all these things just destroys any kind of equilibrium that the economy could have. And every single market is linked together. So this is what is so hard for. And then 70% of the businesses are supposed to be small businesses, and they're the ones that get hit the hardest.
Amen.
They don't have resources.
Brother. Preach.
Well, they don't have the resources. They don't have the lawyers. They don't have the legal teams to help them avoid getting in trouble or having the connections that the big boys do. And it's just a nightmare. I mean, like I said one time, we had the IRS show up because we had forgotten one quarter of payment. We just, I don't know, we were small business, busy hiring people. They came in and they had this huge number, like, you owe this for all these people for Medicare and Social Security. And it's like, what? Are you freaking kidding me? So we had to work out a payment plan, which equated to hundreds and hundreds of dollars every month. No, over 1,000 every month. And I'm like, that's a part-time person we can't hire. It's insane to me. It makes me want to break stuff, Randall. Like this mic right now.
Don't do it.
I want to chew it up. But it's seriously, it is slavery to me. It's just a comfortable slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And we get we get comfortable about it.
You're a small business owner.
Yeah. And as a small business owner, you're expected to know all these different things about tax law and it's just I'd like to see some city like business licenses, okay? Business licenses in a city. I'd love to see a city that says, you know what? You're a new business? Great. Free business licenses for your first year or 2 years in business. We want to encourage you to come to our city and grow with us. And as a result, when you're starting up and you're strapped for cash, the city obviously isn't strapped for cash like a new business. So we're going to give you authorization to come on in and do business. You got to fill out the paperwork, whatever, but we'll give it to you for free.
Right.
It never happened.
Well, I like that you're bringing that up. The problem is with maritime law and the UCC and all of the planning districts and everything in the Fed control, it's really hard to have a truly free society or city or whatever because there's just so much control. I've often heard people say, and I've said, I'd love to get an island and just, no laws or by no government laws from any of the current government. You'd restart it with a charter, and you'd follow that charter. And that works well in business. Like I know a guy who ran he created $1 billion fund over several years, and they had a charter, and they never went outside that charter. So it was very strict, but basically within that charter, they could do anything they wanted. And that's the kind of thing I'd like to see. Did I take this into a different direction?
You did, but we had kind of talked about this.
That's what I was doing. That was the segue.
You were segueing it. Nice. So I saw this video today, this guy talking about how it might be advantageous to do something like that, either getting an island or finding a poorer country that has land, but it's not developed because they're third world or whatever, and having a group of people come together and buy the land or lease the land or whatever to create an economic and law-free zone, basically, so that the individuals could come there, whatever, I don't know, pay something to come in. I don't know. He wasn't really specific on how someone would join, but that they could come there and basically be free, have liberty, right? And just kind of have a reset. And that got me thinking, and we talked about this the last time we were on the Kate Daly show a little bit about, going in a direction like that. I mean, there have been a few projects like that, like the Free State Project, which if the listeners aren't familiar with that, it's a libertarian movement where they decided we need to find a small state with a small population. And if so many people decide that they're willing to move to that state, that we all, once there's that many people, I mean, and people can move beforehand, but once there's so many people that have signed on, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, however many people, that they would then move to that state and then cause a political disruption, basically, be able to have enough people to affect a positive political change in that area, bring libertarian policy back, and remove oppression in government. And so that's a project that's been going on. I think the trigger's already happened, so people should be moving. They have so many years to move back to New Hampshire is the state that was chosen for the Free State Project. But something like this country, a land from the country is a similar idea, although even further, because we're eliminating the government. We're not trying to take control of the government. We're just eliminating it. And anyway, that caused me to reflect a little bit because when I was, pretty young, I had a cousin that came and he told me about this magical land south of Phoenix, Arizona. Is very undeveloped, and how Phoenix or Arizona had zoning laws zoning laws regarding hay bale homes, straw bale homes. And, the idea was that, they're really energy efficient. We go down and we just build like a little enclave down there and we could just kind of be our own island, right? Out in the middle
Right.
of the desert, and with a mild enough climate that you could grow stuff in the middle of the winter and whatever, And I like the idea of that. So kind of the same concept, just getting away from society, removing myself, and then you and I, we went through a similar process, about a decade ago, or even further.
I want to tell this.
Well, anyway, during that process, you can tell about the process here in a minute, but during that process, I started to see that decision in a totally different light, because here I was as an individual. I felt like I had received some enlightenment on economics, on the relationship of law to man, where rights come from. I had received this additional information, and I felt, that would have been morally wrong for me to make that decision to leave society. Because if everybody does that, sure, we read about Galt's Gulch and Atlas Shrugged, and lots of people get excited about that. But what does that do to society? And is society really that far gone that it would just implode, or would it just make it worse for everyone else if all the producers and the people who understood those principles left? I don't know. Sorry, I keep rambling. Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I don't have a problem with it. I just feel like, unlike Galt's Gulch, if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, there's the part where basically the richest people in the world, or the most productive, go into the Rocky Mountains, and they develop this defense system that creates an optical illusion over their mountain village, so that planes can't see it, and the whole world's falling apart anyway. So we discussed with construction guys who own a construction outfit building something like that, and it's funny because they took it serious. But I don't know. I wouldn't have a problem with doing the New Hampshire Free State Project thing, but you would need a sufficient number of people to have a decent economy, so that you had all bases covered, from medical to commerce, all those things. So it need to be at least 100,000 people. I did find this interesting story, though. We're not the only ones who have thought of this. There was a man in 2015, a Czech man, who was claiming to be president of a new country he founded, and it's called Liberland. It's based on liberty.
Yeah.
And it's a 3-mile square thing, and his philosophy is awesome. There's a website for it, but essentially it's between Serbia and Croatia, and he expected that he'd have about 100,000 applicants. And it has things, the country's motto is live and let live, and no standing army, and basically all taxes are voluntary. And I've often talked about that. I think that could actually work with good people. So anyway, this is what this guy does. And he says the only kind of opposition they'd put up to foreign forces would be passive defense. So it's not so fake, because when I went to Costa Rica, they haven't had an army since 1947, no military. And, they've been fine, and they've prospered a lot more than their neighbors. So speaking of Nicaragua, that whole mess, that country's got issues. But Costa Rica is about double the standard of living. So people want a libertarian utopia, which is oxymoron to say, because libertarians accept life as it is.
They don't believe in a utopia.
Well, it says that the motto of the country is live and let live. And that's about the best.
I guess that is a libertarian utopia. Just leave me the heck alone.
And it was a protest started by a guy named, his last name is Jedlicka, but he says it started to turn into a real project with real support. So he received about 20,000 roughly applications for citizenship. So anyway, the U.S. Embassy, they wouldn't respond to comment on this story, but nobody takes those people seriously. But there's been plenty of people in this country that have wanted to break away. California's had a big secession movement. So it's not crazy. It's just people seeing how far down the path to slavery we are. We all say it's a country. Isn't that weird? We're on the march to serfdom, turbo boosted, and we're still saying it's a free country. I said that to my kid a few weeks ago, and I'm like, wait a minute. come back here, son.
Yeah, it's not a free country. Let's realize that this. Let's say what it is. It's not a free country anymore. It's not the country that we remember growing up as kids. It's not the country that our grandparents grew up in. It's it's different, and we got to be willing to say that. But the mantra, and that's part of the thing. I mean, it's fun and fine to be patriotic, but patriotism is used today so much more like propaganda was in dictatorships than any other means. It's used as one way to get us. We're nationalized. We're not a federal system. We're a national system now, and so we salute the flag and we say the Pledge of Allegiance and we say it's a free country and we all want to pull up our guns and our flags and run down the road and that somehow makes us free. But when the little adjustments come to take away our liberty and we just either let them happen or don't realize they're even happening, then, I mean, are we really a free country, or are we just, still believe it because we've said it so often? Because you can tell yourself something enough, whether it's true or false, to the point where you actually think it's happening. Well, psychologically.
Our friend Oliver DeMille had that speech he gave called the 4 Lost American Ideals or something like that. And of these, there's 5 ideals, and one of them that he says we've kept is the freedom ideal, meaning we all ascribe to this freedom perspective or philosophy, like we're the freest country in the nation, and we hear this all the time and say it. And so we still have that belief and that part of our philosophy, but the other 4 we've lost, like being Georgic or being an owner, those kinds of things. You have to get that. It's great recording. I wanted to jump back, though, as we're talking about cities. We're in the state of Utah, if you're watching this, and I did some research on charter cities. Now, charter cities, as I said, the governing system is defined by the city's own charter rather than state, provincial, regional, or national laws. And locations where city charters are allowed by law, a city can adopt or modify it, like anything else. They can be run by the residents themselves or through a third-party management system. So there's similar management of the city, and it could be extensive or little. But there's only one city in Utah that is a charter city, and that's Tooele. So they have an actual charter. Now, the wonderful thing about being a charter is you can have your own military, not just police force, but military, and it's all individual to that charter city. And you can basically create any kind of government. Now, for example, in California, if cities have not adopted a charter, they're automatically organized by the state. And such a city is called a general law city, which will be managed by the traditional 5-member city councils. So anyway, so that's the thing. Like, if we were really adamant about creating an independent commonwealth, like they used to call them, then we would look at, well, let's create some kind of charter city, put it near civilization, then maybe it's possible that we could get a little more independence. Randall, I saw a guy a couple years ago in Utah. He's from New York, but he was trying to build his own sovereign nation in Utah called Zakistan. His name is Zach Landsberg. He came up with the yellow and red flag, and he also had official-looking passports made and a border patrol with a giant robot sentry guarding the property guarding the realm, as he said.
The realm. I love that.
Anyway, he says, I know this goal is not going to happen. It's impossible. But going through the motions, I'm trying to make that happen. And his motto for Zakistan is something from nothing. Anyway, this is way fun. Out in the Utah backcountry, 60 miles from the nearest town and 15 miles away from a paved road. So he has the right idea. And yeah, it's a crazy idea, but it's just this yearning for the old days. Because Randall, Americans used to be so rugged and self-reliant and had self-determination as their guide, really because they didn't have any choice. But
in some regards.
But if they were to fast forward or time travel, they'd still get here and be like, what are you guys doing? You're paying how much in taxes?
Now we're all debating about how many of us don't have insurance. Really? And it's a crisis if one of us don't have a cell phone or access to the internet, because those are human rights, obviously.
Yeah.
How does technology become a human right? Really?
How does technology not solve all this problem?
Because government won't let it.
Exactly.
Because we try and take these new solutions and fit them into old. It's like a square peg going into a round hole. It's new. You gotta change the forms of government in order to fit it. And I guess not really change the forms of government so much as not. Government has built up more than the principles. We have all this code and everything else around it that tries to manipulate and manage and change things, and that's just got to kind of be removed in order to let the market flow. And it's kind of interesting. I've recently listened to a book on Audible. Love Audible. There's a plug for Audible, called The 10-Cent Scare. I think it is. I don't have it in front of me, but it's either the 10-cent scare or the 10-cent panic. And it talks about the rise and fall of the comic book industry. Just rise in the early 1900s and how, in the 50s, it just kind of came apart. And it was kind of interesting because I saw these parallels between what was happening in the comic book industry and what happened in the tech industry. Because it was, as comic books started to come around, and they were this new idea, this new concept, this new medium, and they were really popular with a specific vertical, children, right? And so they were selling tons of them, and the people who were making them, they weren't really concerned with, all the bureaucracy that make, offending people or whatever. They're just like, hey, if we do this, it sells, and they just kept churning out comic books, because that, pretty tight timelines, and they were just kicking them out. And next thing they knew, there were all these nationwide protests. There were organized comic book burnings. There were, all these would-be do-gooders trying to go out and make sure that the youth were not corrupted by what was in these comic books. And eventually, it totally decimated the comic book industry. Legislation that came out and public opinion, and it took more than a decade before a few comic book groups were able to recover. Our everyone's favorite Marvel and DC are a few of those that made it through somehow. But anyway, it was really interesting because the industry was flourishing. You'd have someone would come up with a new idea, and within a month or two, instead of just being one comic book that was based on horror, all of a sudden there were 20 different publishers that were all doing horror comics. And,
right.
Then they'd come out with a crime comic, and all of a sudden there were, 20, 40, 60 different publishers that were all coming out with it. So it was like this, someone would do something new, and then everybody else was trying to copy them, and there was no regulation to stop them from doing that. And they all had their own little flair. And I look back at early Silicon Valley, in the late 70s and early 80s, you had all this innovation that was happening, and people were same thing. They were looking at ways to protect themselves, but you'd have someone come out with something, and then someone else would copy it the best they could, and they'd have their own product, They had the IBM PC, and then Compaq came out with theirs. I mean, just everybody was doing their own little thing, and there was no regulation. So it was this market that was organic and just growing and thriving, and it was fulfilling a need. And then, and we've been able to keep that market from a lot of regulation to this point in time. But as we talked about, I think it was just last week, about potential regulation of the internet and what that would lead to. And you've got the same thing here, so we have to fight to make sure that these industries, especially industries that we utilize and we benefit from, and we can identify good benefits from, that we need to make sure that they don't get overly regulated. Otherwise, we may lose them, because they're only going to stay as long as they're profitable.
Well, I think you bring up some good points about. Well, it makes me wonder if we had maintained a relatively free market instead of the junk we have now with crony capitalism, and just an overwhelming amount of free market capitalism, where we would be today. Because I've had my uncle and other people say that, if it wasn't for the space program with NASA, we wouldn't have microwaves, we wouldn't have cell phone technology, we wouldn't have this or that. And it's like, how do you know?
Right.
I mean, human needs are human needs. How do you know that if government wasn't involved, it wouldn't have been there a decade earlier? How do you know we wouldn't have amazing things now that way? How do you know we wouldn't have self-driving cars 10 years ago? What about the internet? The DARPANet was the military equivalent of the internet back in 1960, and then they allowed it to go to universities who shared information. But if it had remained open out of the government's hands, who knows where we'd be today? So maybe we'd be transporting matter through the internet. But the point is, or have like a fiber connection in every home. But the point is, or faster, what would the world look like without the government involvement in those things? I just feel like it could be Jetsons.
Yeah,
Who
well,
knows?
I mean, all you have to do, I think, is go back to like the turn of the 20th century, and go back and look at like Popular Mechanics and all these different magazines that were there at the time. Because, I mean, how many issues came out and were like, this is what your house will look like in 1950, and this is what your house is going to look, the home of the 2000s, and all the early 20th century, there were all these magazines that came out with all these fantastic ideas and concepts and trying to show what was possible. But, and all those have maybe continued. They are not nearly as prevalent over the last several decades as they were at that early turn in the 20th century. There was all this desire, this movement, this passion for growth and invention and, innovative thinking and businesses, and that just kind of pittered off and went into almost nothingness. And so I think you see a glimpse of it here and there, but the vast majority of that, that idea and that mindset, I think, was squashed. Like you were saying, I mean, we did have some wars in there, and they probably impacted it, but that also grew government. Government saw it needing to be a role here and there and wherever, but I think there maybe were more people that said, well, maybe these are roles for government, and maybe that's why we decided we need to have NASA, or we need to have, different agencies in the government. And I don't know, but it seems like there has been a shift there. And I mean, because where are all the big dreamers? I mean, Elon Musk is out doing it, right? He's trying to change space travel and the auto industry, but who else is really pushing the envelope in that dramatic of a way? Other than most inventors today are just innovating a little bit here, just minutely, just a little idea, a little change. None of these grand transformations of industries that were foretold in those magazines so long ago.
Yeah, the world, like I said earlier, the influence and involvement of force by the government changes so much that we can't know the world we could have. We only know the world that we do have.
Well,
we'll be right back.
Oh, really?
Is that mine or you?
Huh?
I just heard a Red Lobster ad.
Oh, it must be you.
Oh, I don't know. Websites, who knows?
Anyway, because on that note, you're talking about what industries may look like without, or may have looked like without government intervention. I think a great industry to talk about in that regard would be healthcare. Because right now, I mean, you've had Obamacare. It's been moldering in the markets for a while, and now the Republicans have repealed it. And so everyone, I mean, the top story as we were getting ready for the show was that uninsured ranks still grow by tens of millions under the latest House health care bill. Okay. So when did it become so important for everyone to be insured? Have we even asked if there are people who may not want to be insured? Have we asked if it's always beneficial to be insured? Have we asked if the doctors want to deal with insurance? Or do we want, or should we provide an option for individuals to say, you know what? No, I don't want to carry insurance. I don't want to be burdened by that. Maybe I want to be on a cash basis. I want to, well, whether you call that self-insurance or not, maybe I want to be able to work with my doctor. Maybe I want to be able, I mean, can you imagine what the difference would be in the medical industry if it was freed up and not under the regulation of government as it sits today? I mean, like you were just saying, you know, we can't even conceive what the differences could be and what we're missing out on. We look at where we are and we say, wow, this is awesome. And that's great. We should be appreciative of where we are because there is some amazing advancements, amazing technology that is at play. But where would we be if the industry had been left to its own devices, if the industry had been given the opportunity to write its own rules? I mean, we've been involved in managed care with the government being involved there since the 60s at least, you know, where the government has been messing around and saying, these are the things you have to do. You have to allow this, you have to provide this coverage. And it's like, you know what? The industry then moves into that specific vein. You know, it's like, well, John Oliver just had a bit that he did not long ago about dialysis and how the industry, there's only really two major players in the dialysis market where they go and provide dialysis services, but he's complaining about how corrupt and awful they are, but they're in there because the government pays for this and they pay a certain amount. And so they try and build their business plans and everything else around what they can get from the government. It's not to say that we're callous, that we think that people who need dialysis should die. That's not the point here. The point is when you create a government program like that, however, good-hearted it may be at the time, government is a gun. And so it's not a benign force that's just going to go out and help these people who have kidney failure and make them better by putting in some of the harms that were reported in John Oliver's piece on Last Week Tonight was the fact that these agencies, they'll come in and when they initially have an initial consultation, they'll basically either won't bring up the possibility of a kidney transplant or will say, you know what, you'll probably be fine without a kidney transplant, because then they have an incentive to keep you on dialysis for the rest of your life because then they get the payments from the government, right?
Yeah.
It's like it messes up the system.
It's so hard for them to get away. Well, it's so hard for you to get off that once you do. The other thing, too, is that we have the war machine going on, and I heard a great speech a few months ago that said the average veteran that returns from war, with all the costs of the VA benefits, all the costs of the psychiatric and often medical costs, all the costs to family, all the problems with suicide, all that, it said it averages 50 years of costs, not only to government, but ultimately to we the people, per veteran. And that's not even calculating the costs military service can have on the children for decades. And so the cost is almost impossible to calculate. But a lot of it, they said it's at least a 50-year effect of whatever financially on the soldiers. So there's also that. Now, if you have that huge effect and you have several veterans committing suicide every day, that does impact the market and the people of this nation as well, because they make different choices. And then you always hear people advocating for government to take care of more people. And so nobody is ever happy with government, whether it's their pension or whether it's their benefits. No one is ever satisfied with what they're getting. It's never enough. It's not high quality enough. And I found this article, Randall, on intellectualtakeout.org called DePaul Professor Says the Free Market Isn't That Free. And he's not saying the state of the economy isn't that free. He's saying the concept of a free market is not that free. He said, his name is, William Kavanaugh of DePaul University of Chicago, and of course Obama taught at University of Chicago. So apparently there's a Chicago School of Economics. But he wrote a book entitled Freedom and Unfreedom, and he argues that the way the free market understands freedom eventually leads to greater imbalances of power and the diminishment of freedom. And isn't this the core argument between free marketeers and Keynesians, or, at least the people who argue for a social safety net? So he says, according to Milton Friedman, the central problematic of economics is how to ensure the cooperation of free individuals without coercion. That answer was provided by Adam Smith, according to Friedman, who saw that in the absence of external coercion or government force, two parties entering to exchanges because it will be mutually beneficial for them to do so, provided the transaction is bilaterally voluntary and informed. According to Friedman, if individuals are voluntarily entering into exchanges for which both parties expect to benefit, then the market is free. Now, this author talking about this professor says he has two main problems with his understanding of freedom. Number one, that freedom is merely defined negatively, that is, as freedom from the interference of others, especially from the state. And two, that the free market has no telos, that is, no common end to which desire is directed. Now, what does that mean? What he's saying is that without some invisible hand of the opposite invisible hand that Adam Smith is talking about, but something to guide and organize and structure, that you can't depend on people to make good choices, that some transactions will be detrimental to society as a whole because people will make bad choices. But the problem that he doesn't see is this. If there's a small percentage of people that act criminally or greedy, as there is in life in every caste and social segment, then the general overwhelming power of people that are honest and good and no longer have to deal with government corruption and force would counter that. The counterweight would be so strong that generally there would be a free market wherein people would have the most choices, as you talked about earlier. But keep in mind that this Kavanaugh, who teaches at the DePaul University of Chicago, is teaching the new generations economic philosophies based on status silliness. That all makes sense?
That made sense. But it's totally true. It's like there are people who are scared of an economy or a society or just groups of individuals that are not organized into some specific mechanism. They're not they aren't forced to conform into a certain area. I mean, and parents are like this with their kids too. And that's one thing that was really interesting, as this story I told you about, the 10-cent scare, talking about comic books, because there were all these kids that they said they never read comic books, or they'd only looked at one or two and just they weren't very passionate about them. But when they had these comic book burnings, or people saying, no, you can't look at that, and they took them away, it always caused greater interest from the kids. And then they went out and they started being avid comic readers. They would find them and they would hide them and make sure that their parents didn't know about them, because all of a sudden it was the forbidden fruit, right? Just like the war on drugs will never work because it entices more people to want to try it, because if it's illicit and it's not allowed, then I need to try it to see if it's any good. Just like the way alcohol was during Prohibition, it was, well, and even it is sometime today, underage people want to get a hold of alcohol because it's limited from their access, so they want to get a hold of it. It's the forbidden fruit. And so, but that's the common thing all the way along the line. And so to think that we can try and mold society by forcing decisions one way or the other, it's just like, the tendency of the free spirit inside each of us is to say, well, wait a second. Most people are just going to say, you know what, I'm not going to just follow the line. I want to learn about it. I want to understand it. I want to go my own way. And so you end up losing. You may cause more problems. I mean, war on drugs is the perfect example, causing a lot more issues than you solve by trying to make it, trying to mold society into choosing correctly where it comes to, drug usage. It's just, it's insane. It's insane. Well, but these people feel like they need to be a positive force in the world. And what's happening is you may get the end that you want in some regard, but you're missing the boat, and you're pushing society beyond where you really want them to be, and you're going to end up with an animal that's totally unlike what you're hoping for.
Well, this is something else from that article I found interesting. He says this author, Dan is his name, he's still analyzing Kavanaugh, the professor, and he said, when an economic system does not promote a common objective and related to human flourishing, Kavanaugh believes that what's left is sheer power exercised by companies. Interesting. He says over time, their will to power will result in the diminishment of freedoms for an increasing number of people. Okay, interesting philosophy, but here's the rub. Whether through advertising that preys on the weaknesses of consumers, crony capitalism, or the felt need of businesses to employ even cheaper forms of labor. Now, here's the total contradiction. He says within a free market, companies will get big and take advantage of people, and there will be crony capitalism. So what he's saying is we need to create almost a totalitarian system that imposes one version of human flourishing on the public. But that's the problem. There can't be crony capitalism without government tied to those companies. It's fundamentally impossible. That's what the phrase crony capitalism means. So on the one hand, he's saying, well, let's have the state impose this human flourishing on the public. But on the other, he's saying, if we don't, there will be crony capitalism. And I'm saying, well, they're married. Right. Companies are married. Now, the politicians only have to do one thing, Mr. Kavanaugh, not accept money from companies, cut off the lobbyists. Now, I know that's hard, and I know there won't be millions of dollars for each of these knuckleheads in office, but that's what you do. That's what you do. You get a small little income from your service. I mean, the founding fathers were okay with that, but that's it. You figure out how to raise money from all of your followers. Like Ron Paul had 91% of his contributions came from individuals. Right. And he only had 9% from companies. Well, obviously, these would not be companies that were crony capitalists. That were looking for his favor in order to help get some legislation through. If you're you're trying to get lobbyists to do what you want with this politician, you might as well throw your money in the freaking oven. There's no point. Ron Paul is not going to say, okay, when I get in, I'll appoint your CEO to a special board, and I'll get him dinners with the president and, whatever else he wants. But that's this intellectual understanding of economics that is like a 5-year-old. Like, oh, we let you out of control, you'll just be mean. So I'm going to get the government to be mean, and yeah, because ultimately, like what you're saying, without the government being there and the cronies in Washington, D.C. or the state capitol or wherever, without those cronies in positions of power, there is nothing to force individuals or other companies to go along with the plans of another company. Yep. And so, on the one hand, you could say, yeah, but they could collude. You're right. They could collude. But if the market's free, then there's nothing to stop other individuals from starting new companies to work against them. I mean, if they're providing a service that people are satisfied with, then there's not going to be enough of a market for someone to come in and try and oust them. Yeah, there's high barriers of entry with especially technical, like Intel. I mean, you got AMD and Intel. You're going to start a microchip company? No, that's very difficult. Right. But a lot of things, and the other thing too, Randall, real quick, is that companies get so big that essentially or necessarily they're going to become less efficient at what they do in a lot of areas or overall. And then there's going to be these smaller companies that come in, or competitors who see opportunities. And that's how it should work. And in theory, it would work. In reality, probably, but we're imperfect human beings.
Yeah,
so
and I'm sure an individual...
It's not a utopia.
This individual is probably saying, yeah, but if you get a really big company, they may make it really difficult for that small company to be able to conduct business. Well, that's great. That's a perfect example. I mean, depending on how they go about it, but that's a perfect example of how the judicial branch should be used in order to maintain equality among businesses. You know, that they have equal right. You can't just have a business come in and be overtly mean to another company. I mean, so if they came in and say they bought out the property that they were doing business in and they kicked them out, well, that's great. They can find another place. It's like they're still not stopping them from doing business. And if they do something that is illegal, that's the exact role of the law in order to protect the startup company and give them a way to say, you know what, these guys, they did X, Y, Z. These are illegal things. So, that's the way they get to go after the company and keep them in check. But when the government takes sides, it can create an environment that is impossible for the smaller company to break into, regardless, because they have to do so much in order to match regulation, or that the government basically locks them out of the industry. And that's what crony capitalism is. So this economist, he's blowing smoke. He doesn't understand what markets really are. He doesn't understand how a free market works. He's just a totalitarian and in sheep's clothing, right?
Well, what I would love to see, how many professors of economics actually have run a business and hired people? That is one of the quickest ways to get people on social media to be quiet, is by asking them, have you ever run a business? How many people have you hired? I mean, those are very important questions, because it goes from being theory to actually on ground, on the boots on the ground.
Ground on the boots. I like it.
Boots on the ground on the boots. Boots on the neck.
Ouch.
Whether it's a left or right boot, it matters not.
That's right. Amen. Preach, brother. Preach.
Well, you mentioned suing or having lawsuits or, having the judicial work things out. That's an entire different topic when you get into trademark law, you get into patents and all those things. And there's definitely solutions for that. And I'm interested in that because the founding fathers had some, I don't always agree with what they say in these areas, funding for sciences and those kinds of things. So definitely not the post office. But anyway, we're running out of time, but we hope this has been a great discussion on economics. We're not economists per se, but we have studied this for a long time. And just from your own home economy, you can see what principles are fairly obvious or self-evident in your life. And so we just want to encourage you, business owners, small business owners. We love you. We're small business owners, Randall and I. And we appreciate the hard work and the long hours and the commitment and the drive and the vision and everything you have, because we're with you, brothers and sisters. Keep going.
Amen.
Don't give up.
Keep it going.
But if you're a real entrepreneur, I don't have to tell you don't give up.
No.
It's not
you've been fighting that fight for a long time. So,
but we appreciate you.
We do. And so we'd like to have you with us every time that we're talking on the Pyrocast. So go to YouTube, look for the Pyrolitical Live, and subscribe. We'd love to have
Pyrocast.
Yeah, and share with your friends.
Lots of Pyrocasts there. Go check them out. Peace out.
Amen. Take care. Till next week.